Hello everyone, and on this video we will be discovering how to complete the square. Okay, and later we will use the method of completing the square to solve quadratic equations. Alright, so first, the main idea behind completing the square is when you can't factor a quadratic formula very easily. And you can solve it by completing the square. Okay, now the principal idea behind completing the square is the perfect square trinomial, where a plus b squared is a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, and a minus b squared is a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Okay, now the one thing about this is it goes both ways. So if you have a squared minus 2ab plus b squared, you know that's a minus b squared. And if you have a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, you know that's equal to a plus b squared. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking this equation and going the opposite way. Okay, so scrolling up a little bit. In order to complete the square for a quadratic equation with just x squared plus bx, that's the key there, it's just two terms, you want to add and subtract the square of half the coefficient of x. Okay, so if it's x squared plus some value times x, we'll call that value b. You get that b value and divide it by 2. Well, technically it's just 2 squared. Yeah. A is equal to 1, so it's really 2 times 1. Alright. Okay, so let's go ahead and start on our first example. Okay, bring down my paper. So let's say, for example, we want to complete the square of x squared plus 10x. Alright, so on this one, remember, it has to be in the form x squared plus bx for us to complete the square. Okay, so our x squared plus 10x, we see that b is equal to 10. Okay, so you're completing the square, which instead of right now completing the square, you'll see me just put CTS a lot of the times from here. We see that's b divided by 2. A is equal to 1, so you don't have to put anything there. 2 squared, which is 10 divided by 2 squared. 10 divided by 2 is 5, so we end up with 5 squared. Okay, now this is a very important shortcut. So you want to remember the value just before you apply the squared. This is really important because it can cut back on a lot of work down the line. Okay, so 5 squared is 25. Okay, now the 25 is the value we're just going to add and subtract. Alright, so our x squared plus 10x, that's just going to equal x squared plus 10x plus 25 minus 25. Okay, so really all we did was add 0. We added 25, subtract 25, same thing. Okay, now once you do that, you look at the first 3 terms. And that value that I told you to remember, those three terms are going to make the perfect square trinomial of x, and this is a positive 5 here, so it's plus 5 squared minus 25. Okay, so your completed square is x squared, x plus 5 squared minus 25, or it could just be x plus 5 squared in some text. Okay, now there are some texts where they will just want you to put the x plus 5 squared. Move that up for you. So either one of those could be correct depending on what form they want the answer in. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another example. Let me straighten out my papers here. All right. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to complete the square for x squared minus 11x. All right, so just like before, we have x squared plus bx. That's the form we're using. So for your x squared minus 11x, we see that b is equal to negative 11. Okay, so if we wanted to complete the square, completing the square, remember that b divided by 2 is 2a, but a is equal to 1. So it's b divided by 2 squared, which is equal to negative 11 over 2 squared. Remember, before you apply the squared, you want to remember this value. Okay, so negative 11 squared is positive 121, and 2 squared is equal to 4. So this is what you would add or subtract. Okay, so going back to our x squared minus 11x, that is actually equal to x squared minus 11x plus 121 over 4 minus 121 over 4. Okay, so just like before, we're just going to take the first three terms. Okay, now trying to figure out the perfect square trinomial of this could be a little bit of a headache, but fortunately, we remembered that part. So all we have to do is make it x. This is negative 11 over 2, so we make it x minus 11 over 2 squared. Okay, that's why remembering this helps us cut back on a lot of work. We don't have to try and figure out the perfect square trinomial here. Okay, so that's minus, still have your 121 over 4. So you have x minus 11 over 2 squared minus 121 over 4, or some may just have you write x minus 11 over 2 squared in some text. Gotta bring that up. There we go. Okay, so it all depends on what answer your particular text or your particular question is looking for. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead to our next example. Okay, so what if we wanted to complete the square for x squared plus 7 over 3x. Okay, now this one is just a little bit different because your b is a fraction. I'm going to show you a little trick to dealing with that one. So you have x squared plus 7 over 3x. Okay, so we know in this case your b is equal to 7 over 3. Okay, now this is where the steps can change up just a little bit. Normally, completing the square is b divided by 2 squared, which in this case would be 7 over 3 divided by 2 squared. That can get a little bit tricky looking, so I don't write it like this. Okay, so I don't write it like that. So b divided by 2, I write it as 7 over 3 divided by 2 squared. Okay, you can do it like this if you're okay with it and it won't confuse you. But this is how I do it because it's a little bit clearer. And the reason I do it this way is because you can write it as 7 over 3 divided by 2 over 1 squared. Okay, so right now this gives you a division of fractions. So if you remember your steps for dividing fractions, first step is you write down your first fraction, which is 7 over 3. Your second step is your division changes to multiplication. Then your third step is you flip the second fraction. So 2 over 1 becomes 1 over 2. And then you just multiply it across. Okay, so 7 times 1 is 7. 3 times 2 is 6 squared. Okay, now just like before, once you have your value, before you apply the square, you want to remember that value. Okay, so you don't want to apply the square just yet without making a note to remember that value. Okay, so you have 7 squared, which is 49, over 6 squared, which is 36. And this is the value you're going to add and subtract. All right, so let's go ahead and see what that gives us. So x squared plus 7 over 3x, we know that that's just x squared. Oh, let me move that, separate that a little bit. X squared plus 7 over 3x plus 49 over 36 minus 49 over 36. Okay, now once you do that, now you just go ahead and you identify the first 3 terms. Okay, and again, it would be a headache to try and figure out the perfect square trinomial for this, but luckily we have that 7 over 6 that we were wise enough to remember. So this just becomes x plus 7 over 6 squared minus 49 over 36. Okay. Now again, depending on your text, they could just want the x plus 7 over 6 squared as your answer. Again, in some text. Okay, so once again, just depends on what book or program you're using, and that will identify which form they want the answer in. All right. Okay, so that's how you complete the square if you just have a 2-term expression. Now we're going to solve equations using completing the square. All right. Okay. Bring that down a little. All Alright, so these are your steps for completing the square to solve an equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, or a quadratic equation. Alright, so your very first step is kind of a two-parter. For your first step, if your coefficient of x squared is 1, then you just skip step 1 and go to step 2. So if in front of your x squared, if that's just a 1 or there is no value there, you can just skip step 1 and go to step 2. Okay. Now, if your coefficient of x squared is not a equals 1, so that's, let's say, 2x squared, then you're going to divide every term by that a value. Okay, so if that's 2x squared, you're going to divide all of those terms by 2. If that's 7x squared, you're going to divide every term by 7. So whatever is in front of that x squared, you're going to divide all the terms by that value. Okay, now your second step is you're going to isolate all the variable terms to one side of the equal sign and the constants to the other. So really all that comes down to is whatever that c value is, you're going to put the opposite down. So if it's plus 5, you're going to subtract 5 from both sides. If it's minus 6, you're going to add 6 to both sides. So basically just get the constant over there by itself. And we'll go through all of these on the example, each step individually. All right, now your third step is you're going to do the completing the square that we just did. But instead of adding and subtracting, you're just going to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides of the equal sign. And then you're going to factor out the perfect square trinomial. So that's really what we've been doing up to this point. Okay, so everything we did on the previous couple of examples is just step 3. Okay, and then step 4, you're going to solve using the square root property. And don't forget your plus or minus sign, because that's very important with the square root property. Okay, and you can check your answer if you want to, but they can be kind of, I guess you could say, odd. So it's not, you don't have to check it. If you did all the steps right and you're confident in it, you don't have to check it, but you can, just by plugging your answer into your original problem. But again, they can get really complicated, so I don't worry about that too many times. All right. Okay, so if you're still writing, please feel free to press pause. But we're going to go ahead and go to our first example. Bring this down a little. There we go. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to solve x squared minus 8x minus 5 equals 0 by completing the square. Yep, let me see if I can focus that just a little bit. Yeah, it's okay. Okay, now normally when you see this, first thing you do is you try to factor it. You say, okay, find two numbers that multiply to give us our c value and add to give us our b. Unfortunately, finding two numbers that multiply to give you -5 and then using the same two numbers to give you -8, they aren't that easy to just figure out off the top of your head. Okay, so this is where completing the square comes in. Okay, now your first step, you don't have a value in front of the x squared. So if you don't have a value other than 1 in front of the x squared, you can skip that first step. Okay, we only use the first step. Let's say if you had a 4x squared or something like that. If there's nothing in front of the x squared, skip step 1. Okay, so your second step, we isolate our variables. Okay, so by that, what we will do, we have x squared minus 8x minus 5 equals 0. So we just add 5 to both sides. So we have x squared minus 8x equals 5. And by that equation, this lets us know that b is equal to negative 8. So this is what we'll be working with. Okay, so we isolated our variable terms to one side and our constant to the other side. Okay, so now your third step is where we complete the square. Okay, so we have b divided by 2 squared. Okay, so b is equal to negative 8. So this is negative 8 divided by 2 squared. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. That gives us negative 4 squared. And remember, before you apply the squared, you want to remember that value, because negative 4 squared is equal to 16. Okay, now this is the value you want to add to both sides. All right. So since we're adding that to both sides and using this equation here, we have x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 5 plus 16. So all we did was add 16 to both sides. Alright, and if you did everything correctly, as soon as you add your completing the square value, and remember that part that we pointed out, this just becomes x minus 4 because that's a negative 4. X minus 4 squared equals 5 plus 16, which is 21. Okay, so we're done with our third step. So that brings us to your fourth step, which is the square root property. All right. So our square root property, so we have x minus 4 squared equals, I'm going to give that a little bit of space, equals 21. And let me clean that up a little. Here we go. So we're going to square root both sides. And don't forget your plus or minus sign. Okay, once you square root both sides, the left side, the square and the square root, will cancel each other out. So that leaves you with x minus 4 equals plus or minus square root of 21. Okay, so we can go ahead and add 4 to both sides to solve for our x. Okay, so that leaves us with x equals 4 plus or minus square root of 21. Okay, or some of them may want, some of your text or questions may want it as 2 separate answers, so we'll put it as x equals 4 plus square root of 21, or x equals 4 minus square root of 21. Okay, so it can be written as one equation or as 2 separate equations. Okay, so those are all of your steps. Okay, so let's go ahead to our next example. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to solve x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0 by completing the square. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to press pause and solve this using the exact same steps from the previous example. Okay, so go ahead and start on this one. Alright, so assuming you've already pressed pause and you've worked on this one. Okay, so your first step, there's nothing in front of the x squared. So we can go ahead and skip that first step. And your second step, remember, you want to isolate your variables. So your x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0, you're just going to subtract 1 from both sides. So that gives us x squared plus 4x equals -1, where we know that our b is equal to 4. Okay, so that's what we're going to use. Alright, so going to our third step is where we complete the square. And remember, that's b divided by 2 squared. Our b is equal to 4, so that makes it 4 divided by 2 squared. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so that's 2 squared. And remember that value. 2 squared is equal to 4. And once we have it all figured out, we add to both sides. Alright. So that gives us, there we go, x squared plus 4x. So that's x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals -1 plus 4. So again, we just added that to both sides. Okay, and if we did everything correctly, we have our value that we point out here. It's a +2, so this just becomes x plus 2 squared equals -1 plus 4 is 3. Okay, so x plus 2 squared equals 3. Alright, so now we go ahead to our fourth step, where we apply the square root property. So x plus 2 squared equals 3. We just go ahead and square root both sides. And don't forget your plus minus. Okay, so the square and the square root cancels each other out. And that just leaves us with x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 3. So to solve for x, we subtract 2 from both sides, which leaves us with the answer x equals -2 plus or minus square root of 3. Or if they want it written as 2 separate solutions, x can equal -2 plus square root of 3, or x can equal -2 minus square root of 3. Okay, so either one of those could be your correct answer. Alright, so let's go ahead and do another example. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to solve x squared minus 4x plus 16 equals 0 by completing the square. Alright, so what I want you to do here is I want you to go ahead and press pause and solve this one, but be aware that your answer is going to look a little bit different. So you have to kind of go back to some previous classes to solve this one. Okay, but go ahead and try it on your own first, and then we'll go ahead and work through it. Alright, so assuming you have pressed pause and you have already worked through it, let's go ahead and validate your answer. And remember, there's nothing in front of the x squared, so we can actually skip the first step. And we'll have a few examples of when you don't skip the first step. Just for these, we're skipping the first step. Okay. Now your second step, remember, you want to isolate the variables. Which means our x squared minus 4x plus 16 equals 0. We're just going to subtract 16 from both sides, where that cancels out. So that leaves us with x squared minus 4x equals negative 16. Which lets us know also that b is equal to negative 4. Alright, so that's the one we're going to use. Alright, so your third step, remember that's just completing the square. So you have b divided by 2 squared. B is equal to negative 4, so that's negative 4 divided by 2 squared. Negative 4 divided by 2 is just negative 2, so that's negative 2 squared. Of course, before you apply the squared, you want to remember that value. So negative 2 squared is equal to 4. And that's the value we're going to add to both sides. Alright. So we have x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 16 plus 4. So again, we just added it to both sides. Okay, and if you did everything correctly, that's a negative 2 here. So these three terms becomes x minus 2 squared equals negative 16 plus 4 is negative 12. Alright, so now we go to our fourth step, which is the square root property. Okay, so our x minus 2 squared equals negative 12. We're going to square root both sides, and don't forget your plus minus. Okay, so the square and the square root cancels out here. So that leaves us with x minus 2 equals plus or minus, and that square root of 12, it has a perfect square in it. So you can reduce that one. Okay, so square root of negative 12, we know that can become square root of 12i. Remember, the complex numbers. Okay, now also, just kind of separate that, square root of 12 can equal square root of 4 times 3. Now once you separate those two, you have square root of 4 times square root of 3. Square root of 4 is equal to 2, so that gives us 2 square root of 3. So this square root of 12, that becomes 2 square root of 3i. Okay, so this is plus or minus 2 square root of 3i. Or sometimes you may see people with 2i square root of 3. Doesn't matter. It's all multiplication. All right. So just like before, we go ahead and add 2 to both sides. So we see that x can equal 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 3i. And remember, don't put the I under the square root bracket or you'll be most likely marked incorrect. Okay. Or if you want it as 2 separate equations, x can equal 2 plus 2 square root of 3i, or x can equal 2 minus 2 square root of 3i. Okay, so either one of those would be an acceptable answer. Again, just depending on how they want it formed. All right, so let's go ahead to our next example. And bring that down a little. All right, so let's say, for example, if we want to solve 6x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0 by completing the square. Okay, so this one's a little bit different because as you can see, there's a value other than 1 in front of that x squared. So this is where you don't skip step 1. All right. So your first step, since there's a value of 6 in front of that x squared, we're going to divide every term by a equals 6. So that means your 6x squared plus 5x minus 6 equals 0. We're dividing everything by 6. Alright, so once we do that, for your first term, anything divided by itself is 1, so 6 divided by 6 just becomes 1. So that leaves us with x squared plus 5 over 6x. Negative 6 divided by 6 is just minus 1 equals 0. Okay, so that's our first step. Okay, so that brings us to our second step, which is to isolate the variables. So our x squared plus 5 over 6x minus 1 equals 0. Just like before, we're just going to add 1 to both sides where that cancels out. So that gives us x squared plus 5 over 6x equals 1, where we know that our b is equal to 5 over 6. Okay, so now our third step is where we complete the square. Okay, so that's b divided by 2 squared. Remember, this is a fraction, so always write it a little bit differently. Again, if you want to write it as 5 over 6 divided by 2, you're more than welcome to do that. Okay, my way is not the only way, it's just the way that I like. So if you know another way that's, easier for you, by all means, feel free to use that one. Okay, so b is 5 over 6, so this would be 5 over 6 divided by 2. I'm just going to write it as 5 over 6 divided by 2 squared. And again, 5 over 6 divided by 2 is the same as 5 over 6 divided by 2 over 1. squared, or we can divide fractions. So the steps, we write down our first fraction. So we have 5 over 6. Second step is division changes to multiplication. Our third step is we flip the second fraction, so 2 over 1 becomes 1 over 2 squared. Okay, so if we multiply, 5 times 1 is 5, and 6 times 2 is 12. So we have 5 over 12 squared, and of course we remember that value. So 5 squared is 25, and 12 squared is 144, and that's what we add to both sides. All right. So that means our x squared plus 5 over 6 x plus 25 over 144 equals 1 plus 25 over 144. Again, just adding that to both sides. All right, so just like before, trying to figure out the perfect square trinomial of that one would be a little bit time consuming, but we have our value right here. So these three terms will just become x plus 5 over 12 squared. Since that's positive, that's why we have a plus. Equals, and if we go ahead, 1 plus 25 over 144. We can just make that 144 over 144. 144 over 144 plus 25 over 144 is 169 over 144. So 1 plus 25 over 144 is 169 over 144. Okay, so we go ahead and go to our fourth step, which is the square root property. Okay, so we go ahead and square root both sides here. So x plus 5 over 12 squared, I'm going to go ahead and square root of that, equals plus or minus the square root of 169 over 144. Okay, so the square and the square root cancels out. We have x plus 5 over 12 equals plus or minus square root of 169 is 13. And the square root of 144 is 12. Okay, so if we subtract 5 over 12 from both sides, we end up with x equals negative 5 over 12 plus or minus 13 over 12. Okay, now for this one, we won't be able to just leave it like that because this actually can be reduced some more. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to put that right here. Okay, so we have x equals negative 5 over 12 plus 13 over 12. And x equals negative 5 over 12 minus 13 over 12. Okay, so for this one, we have negative 5 plus 13. That's positive 8. So you have 8 over 12, which simplifies to be 2 over 3. So x equals 2/3, one of our answer. And for this one, negative 5 minus 13 is negative 18. So we have negative 18 over 12, which simplifies to be negative 3 over 2, since 6 divides both of those. Okay, so your answer to this one is x equals 2 over 3 and x equals negative 3 over 2. Okay, so they won't always stop at the plus and minus. Okay, sometimes you can simplify it all the way through to an actual solution. Alright, so let's go ahead and do another example. Oh, you're still writing, feel free to press pause. Let me straighten out this, there we go. Okay, so let's say, for example, if we want to solve 2x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0 by completing the square. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and press pause and solve this one using the steps from the example we just did. Alright, so again, because we have a value in front of our x squared, we do not skip the first step, but we divide every term by that a value. Divide every term by a equals 2. Okay, so your 2x squared plus 4x plus 1 equals 0. We divide everything by 2. Okay, so anything divided by itself here is equal to 1. That gives us x squared plus 4 divided by 2 is 2. So we have 2x plus 1/2 equals 0 divided by 2 is 0. Okay, now if you wanted to, you could have isolated your variables there, but we'll just use that as a second step. Isolate variables. So your x squared plus 2x plus 1/2 equals 0. We just subtract 1/2 from both sides. So these two disappear. So we have x squared plus 2x equals negative 1/2, where our b is equal to 2. Okay, so that's all the information we need right there to keep going. So remember, your third step is where you complete the square. Okay, so that's b divided by 2 squared. So that becomes b is equal to 2. So that's 2 divided by 2 squared, which is equal to 1 squared. And you want to remember that value. And 1 squared is just equal to 1. And that's what we add to both sides. Okay, so going ahead to do that, you have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals negative 1/2 plus 1. So again, we just added the 1 to both sides. If we did everything correctly, that value here just makes this trinomial x plus 1 squared. And negative 1/2 plus 1, you can just make that negative 1/2 plus 2 over 2, which is equal to positive 1/2. So negative 1/2 plus 1 is equal to 1/2. Alright, so our fourth step, again, is our square root property. So we square root both sides, and don't forget your plus or minus. So x plus 1 squared equals 1/2. We square root both sides and put our plus or minus there. The square and the square root here cancels out. So you have x plus 1 equals, and this will be a little bit tricky, and I'll show you why. Because the square root of 1/2 is square root of 1 over square root of 2. Square root of 1 is equal to 1, so you have 1 square root of 2. Okay, now the tricky part is you have to remember that most math texts do not like to have a square root or any kind of a root symbol in your denominator. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to multiply 1 over square root of 2 by the denominator, square root of 2 over square root of 2. So that gives us 1 times square root of 2, which is square root of 2. Square root of 2 times square root of 2 is 2. So this becomes plus or minus square root of 2 over 2. Alright, so if we subtract 1 from both sides, that gives us x equals -1 plus or minus square root of 2 over 2. Which, if you separate it into two separate equations, x can equal -1 plus square root of 2 over 2, or x can equal -1 minus square root of 2 over 2. Okay, so either one of those would be correct depending on the text. But just as a heads up, you might see it written a little bit different. Because remember, 1, you can just write that as -1, you can write that as -2 over 2. So you can make it x equals -2 plus or minus square root of 2 over 2, because that's just -2 over 2. Or you can have x equals -2 plus square root of 2 over 2, or x can equal -2 minus square root of 2 over 2. Okay, the exact same answers, but it is possible that they can be written differently. So these two are the exact same as these two, just written differently. Alright, just didn't want you to be caught off guard if you happen to see your answer look like this. Alright, so hopefully this made sense, and I'll see you on the next video.